Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. I'm your host, Tony Duty, and I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the HigherEdLive network. You can tune in to Student Affairs Live along with my brilliant friend and co-host, Heather Shea, Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. HigherEdLive is produced by M. Stoner, a digital-first agency committed to tailored solutions that drive real results. You can visit mstoner.com to learn more about what they do. This broadcast is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. Support for College Student Affairs Live is one of the many ways ACPA provides innovative professional development. Visit myacpa.org to discover additional personal and professional development opportunities. I want to take a moment to thank Kate Zula, who is helping to monitor the back channel and forwarding to me your best content and questions from the Twitterverse. And finally, I am honored to have join us today Sara Goldrick-Rab. I'm sorry, did I pronounce that right, Sara?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Sara, can you start us off by describing your current role and what compelled you to research college affordability in the first place?
Okay, well, thanks for having me. I am a professor at Temple University in higher education policy and sociology. And I joined Temple about 2 years ago now, where I used to be at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I've been, for a long time, really interested in this question of why some students finish college and others don't, and in particular, why there's so much inequality and persistent inequality in who gets the opportunity to complete college. It's really, really clear, for example, that people who are the first in their family to attend college can get huge benefits from completing those degrees, but their chances of completing are incredibly low. And in my exploration of those issues, I have really come to land on a serious set of structural problems. And those problems intersect in an area that students talk about all the time, but colleges often don't talk about, and that is having to do with their living expenses. And discovering that their need to live while in school and the need to have a roof over their heads and something to eat ends up creating a set of circumstances for them and challenges like work that end up reducing their chances of completing their degrees. And so I'm really engaged in a search for solutions.
Excellent. So I've read the book. I encourage other folks to read the book. I think you shared with me you're going on your 2-year anniversary of the publishing of that book.
Yeah. September 2016. Yeah.
Okay. So can you briefly outline the research study that informed much of the book?
Right. So, okay. Basically, the idea was this: if we want to understand how students who receive the Pell Grant fare in college, the best way to figure out what life is like for them is to actually just follow them and their lives as they unfold, as they try to move through school. So rather than, say, take a bunch of people and ask them a bunch of questions at one point in time and try to decide, what's working for them and what's not, if we really want to understand them in a dynamic way, well, then we need to do a longitudinal study and stick with them. So that's what we did. This is a study that was started in 2008, in the fall of 2008, and it's based in Wisconsin. And the reason it's based in Wisconsin is really, really simple. I lived there, and a private foundation approached me and my team wanting to know if, when they gave Pell Grant recipients more money for college, if it would help them. And we said, well, let's find out. And so we took a group of people who were eligible for that program, and they were attending 42 different public 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities all over the state. And we followed them around in a legal IRB-approved manner, compliant with FERPA and everything else. And we did that for 6 years. And we stuck with them whether or not they stayed in college. So if you want to know what drives somebody out of school, you're not going to just find that out by only looking at them at the moment they're in school, but also seeing them on the other side. And over time, we've got 3,000 students over 6 years, and we've got surveys with them and interviews with them and financial aid data on them and academic records on them. And, the book analyzes all that data and constructs a narrative about, what they taught us.
So did that fund for Wisconsin Scholar Grants, did that help in degree completion? Like what did you find?
Well, it did and it didn't, right? And the interesting thing is, I think that's the lesson for financial aid more broadly. It did some things and other things it couldn't really do. So, for example, we do see that students who were offered additional support, who were attending four-year institutions, did exhibit higher rates of bachelor's degree completion over the next 4 years. But the overall amount, the increase, was small. And even with that support, only about 20% of those students finished degrees in 4 years. Moreover, for the 2-year students, the students who were given the money at the community colleges and the technical colleges in Wisconsin, we didn't really see demonstrable improvements in their outcomes. And I think if we had done a typical study, the kind of thing that normally happens, we would have concluded, well, look, it's not really about money. That would have been a mistake. Because what we really saw happen was the failure of the financial aid system to really deliver the money the students needed in the way that they needed it for the things that they needed it for. And the truth is that while these well-meaning philanthropists were trying to get a fair bit of money in the hands of these students, a lot of it was displaced. In other words, students didn't get the money they were expecting to receive. And so because of the depth of the information and the complexity of what we were able to look at, we were able to see that we don't conclude, well, financial aid's a failure, but the current system sure isn't working.
Gotcha. Now we had a conversation before we started broadcasting about Pell Grants, and I believe you have a pet named Pell, not one of your children, a pet, right?
A cat.
A cat. So can you share a brief history of the Pell Grants and explain why you've alluded to this a little bit, but why they're less effective when they were first enacted back in 1973?
Yeah. Okay. So the Pell Grant program is a very well-intentioned program, and it was started by a guy, Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, who really understood what a lot of people are just now figuring out, which is that there's a lot of inequality in who gets to go to college and who gets to graduate from college, and that inequality is very sticky. It's very hard to move the dial. But he said it is not right for the family that you're born into to determine your life chances, particularly your chances of getting an education. That is antithetical, he said, to the American dream. If you're talented and you work hard, you should be able to get to go to school. And so the Pell Grant was supposed to basically cover the entirety of the cost of attending college for a student who went in the public sector, and it was supposed to make a big dent for the students in the private sector. And the reason was simple, because if you covered the full cost, then at least in theory, family income would have no influence on college attainment. Okay, so the thing is, there was a debate about whether those monies should go to the school to lower the price for the students up front, or whether they should go to the student. And the student holding this voucher in their hands, this Pell Grant, would take it to the institution and present it and get a discount. And in doing so, would be able to hold the institution responsible for an affordable, high-quality education. That is actually a market-driven model. It should sound very familiar. It's not dissimilar to the voucher models in place now in K-12 education. Here's your discount, go to the school, it will become affordable for you. Fast forward, and several things have changed. The first thing is that the value of the Pell Grant has declined dramatically. So it was supposed to cover 100%, and the way that was going to happen was through a concerted effort of both the federal government and the states, and to some extent the colleges. That concerted effort, it never happened. As a result, today, largely due to state disinvestment and rising prices at private institutions, the Pell Grant covers only about 60% of the cost of attending a community college, only about a third of the cost of attending a public university, and barely 13% of the cost of attending a private institution. So now students are taking their vouchers to institutions, and they're getting a much smaller discount than they actually need. And it's not that surprising in my view, because the students bringing the vouchers to the institutions are still a minority of the students at those schools. The institutions don't have to listen to them. They're not a powerful constituency. As a result, the voucher is not all that meaningful. And institutions do not feel like they better serve those Pell recipients really well with low prices. And states don't feel that way either. Instead, as we all know, they turn to the people with real money and they cater to their needs.
So when people think about Pell Grant recipients, they often assume that they're awarded primarily to lower income students. Can you talk about the current profile of Pell Grant recipients?
Well, I mean, certainly among college students, they are the lower income students. But we have to remember that while we've moved in higher ed to talking about completion instead of access, we still have a massive access problem. Only 50% of low-income people who graduate from high school go to college. So if you take the broader swath of America and you say who's low income in America, they're a pretty small chunk of the people in higher ed. So if you take people at the $15,000 level, right, $15,000 a year or less of family income, most of them are not in college. And so if you look and you say how many Pell recipients are from families with $15,000 or less, it's not going to be that many. So what's interesting is that a lot of people, particularly politicians, will say, well, look, the problem with Pell recipients, is that their families are on welfare and they're dependent on the system and they don't have value of work. That's wrong on so many levels, including that a tiny fraction of Pell recipients were raised on families on welfare. The number one reason, by the way, is we took welfare away from most families, and we did that 20 years ago. And the second reason is that it's still the case that if you did get cash assistance as a child, your chances of going to college aren't high. The result is that your typical Pell recipient is actually closer to lower middle class. And they look a lot like the people making decisions these days. I think one of the things that I try to point out in the book is I think most people assume, well, if you find the modal Pell recipient, they're African-American, poor, and, from a single parent home, all the scary things. And that's nonsense, because the biggest group receiving the Pell Grant overall are non-Hispanic white people from low to moderate income families. And they have two-parent homes. And they're already doing a lot of work to make ends meet. By the way, so are the African Americans. But my point is there are these racialized stereotypes of Pell Grant recipients the same way there are of any other recipient of a poverty program. And it doesn't match the data.
Now, you as you said, you tracked these students or you followed these students throughout the last 6 years. And as I listened to some of these stories of the students you interviewed, I was blown away. I was overwhelmed. It just seems like this labyrinth of complexities that they have to navigate, not just for students, but also for financial aid professionals. Can you talk about some of the challenges that financial aid offices encounter today?
Yeah. So what you're referring to is that while we were doing the study on the students, I also became increasingly interested, frankly, in the aid officers, because the aid officers were talked about by the students, and so are the student affairs professionals, I should mention. And I don't think it's very fair as a researcher to hear only one side of the story. And so I began trying to get some money to do more interviews with aid officers. If you look at the field, there's been very little written about aid officers other than by the aid officers themselves, which is certainly important. But you can't find a great book telling you what it's like to be somebody who has to administer a widely implemented but underfunded program where your boss at the end of the day is the federal government, not your college. And what I discovered from these interviews is that these are classic frontline workers. They are given a mandate. They are given very few resources. They are given a huge pile of rules and regulations. And then they're asked to confront on a daily basis people with deep needs. And they are the ones implicated in the decision over whether or not to meet those needs. And they say things like, look, on a given day, I'm a lawyer, I'm an accountant, I'm a social worker. I'm a mom. I'm just somebody who cares about these people. Many of these financial aid professionals were themselves work-study students. It's how they got in the profession. And I think that we have done them a huge disservice because we've tasked them to do literally the impossible. They're administering too little money with too many rules, and there are competing incentives, and they don't get to make the decisions, and they're blamed for everything. And they're the ones who get yelled at, and they're the ones who the students cry in front of, and they're the ones who the students castigate on Twitter. And if you just follow hashtag FAFSA at the start of each year, you will see how ugly it gets for them. And I feel so much for them.
So you talked about all the different roles that they take on, and they're touching so many different aspects of the student's life. It made me wonder, should this be extended? Can academic advisors, career advisors, student peers, even alumni be enlisted if trained properly to help with this kind of financial advisement? Have you seen models that have done that?
I mean, what I've seen are some schools are trying to cross-train teams, right? So they're trying to make sure that the people on the student affairs side understand more about financial aid, and the people on the financial aid side know more about student affairs. And ideally, the academic advisors would know more about financial aid. Because, I mean, let's just take an example. A student who comes to college and falls short of the money she needs and doesn't want to take on student loans. A student like Chloe Johnson in my book, who ends up working 2 jobs while taking 5 classes and falls asleep in her classes because she just, she's commuting and she's not sleeping and she's working all the time and she's trying to study and it doesn't work. So when that student runs into SAP trouble, satisfactory academic progress trouble, and she goes to her aid office about it, what that student will typically hear is, you need to drop a class, okay? Or you need to take easier classes. That is what we've seen happen. The academic advisor might feel very differently about that. The academic advisor might say, well, let's get you a tutor, right? Or you need to quit working. And to be honest, it isn't clear whose advice is the good advice. Because if a student drops a class, the student might not make satisfactory academic progress. If a student switches to an easier major, well, their entire plan for their career could be derailed. I often wonder how much of the academic advising done by financial aid officers is responsible for the drift we see of low-income students away from STEM fields. Because what's hard? Math and science is hard. And when you need to keep your financial aid, maybe you just opt out. And that's incredibly sad because the entire point of the financial aid system was to free students to focus on school, not to constrain their decisions about their academics. And SAP represents an intersection of the two that puts people in impossible decisions and choices, and the staff are sort of floundering with how to deal with it.
Now, you just mentioned Chloe Johnson. You also shared a story, and I don't think it was about Chloe Johnson, about a student who was falling asleep in your class. Mind sharing that story and what it taught you?
Well, yeah. I mean, I say it with a bit of embarrassment because, I mean, I have to be honest, my reaction, I was like an early assistant professor. I came to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They hired me without a shred of teaching experience. I had very little public speaking experience. I had very little teaching experience. And so when I was up there and that young woman started falling asleep in my class, I thought, oh my God, I'm boring. I'm not a good teacher. Man, I really wish I knew something about pedagogy. And instead, I sort of tried to get over it at some point because I kept watching her fall asleep. And at some point I went to her and tapped her on the shoulder and said, come see me in office hours. And I didn't mean to threaten her with that. I just meant, come talk to me because I need to know what's going on here. I mean, am I boring you? I don't know. And she came to my office and she was visibly frightened. It turns out she'd never been to an office hour before. She was a rising senior and she didn't know what to expect. And she sat down and I said, what's going on? She said, what do you mean? I said, what's going on? You're falling asleep. And she said, I'm sorry, but I get off work like an hour or two before your class in the morning. It turns out she worked the graveyard shift at the local supermarket, stocking shelves all night. And I said, why do you do that? I said, sort of with somewhat outrage and clearly no understanding, having not come from the working class. And she's like, what, are you kidding me? This is how you get through college. Or if you work at night. And she said, that's all I can find. And I looked at her and I just thought, oh my God, I so missed this. I so just missed this. It never occurred to me that she got off of work that late. And I said, don't you have other options for work? And she looks at me like I'm crazy. And as I talked to her about what else was going on and what other options she had, I came to realize that she really was doing the only thing she could. And the problem was she's going to fail my class. So in that moment, my solution was, I think, a very typical one, which is a charitable impulse. And I said, I have research money. I'll make you a work study job. You'll work for me. Quit that job. That was just like something I was able to do, and I couldn't do it at scale. What's interesting to me is that over time, as I learned there were more and more and more of these students, right, I started to understand the need to move beyond the charitable impulse and to move towards systemic solutions, which has been the evolution of my career. And to be honest, work study worked. She graduated. She liked what we did in my program so much. She came back and got a master's degree in educational policy, and she's employed at the institution she graduated from. So this works. And the biggest, most important part was that I managed to get over my own biases and insecurities and just notice her.
Nice. I often share with people, we make assumptions without truly understanding someone's story. So I love that story. And
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing it. So you brought up work study. Let me jump to a question about work study. In your book, you note that the funding formula for distributing federal work study monies to institutions hasn't changed for decades, and the current approach favors wealthier students at private schools. The federal work study program, quote, rewards the most expensive institutions who have been in the program the longest. This seems antithetical to the spirit of the program. I mean, I'm sure this is upsetting to you. What can be done to fix and improve the existing model? Yeah. And how does this relate to disparities in cost of living from region to region?
Right. So look, I mean, the work study program is a great idea. The idea that you would work on campus, cutting down on commuting time, and having an employer who knows you're in college and supports that idea, that's important. Because a lot of what's happening to students is that the time they have to take to commute to their jobs and the hassle they have to deal with employers who say, I'm sorry you have class, but I really don't care, show up for my class. That's a big part of why they fall short when they're trying to make ends meet in school. So the problem, as you said, is that the funding formula for higher education's work study program hasn't been revised in decades. And while it is a formula, and it includes how many students at the school need the program, the number of people who needed it 30 years ago at these institutions is a different number than today. I mean, if you imagine how young the community colleges were, for example, when that funding formula was put into place, you'll quickly see the problem. King Alexander, the president of Louisiana State University, has pointed out that work study dollars flow towards Plymouth Rock. The reason is the oldest institutions in the country are closer to Plymouth Rock. All right. So there's a very simple solution. We need to update the formula. And I think we could go further. I think we could hold institutions accountable for using the dollars for good work study jobs. So a good work study job is a job with an office that has an interest to the student, or with a faculty member whose research is interesting to the student. A bad work study job is a job on dorm crew at Harvard, where you clean up the dorms of other students, and you have to clean the bathrooms of those students and leave a card with your name on it. Harvard uses work study money, federal work study money, to finance dorm crew.
Where's the study part of that?
Yeah, there's the idea is they work, and so they get to go to Harvard. And so, I think practices like that should be re-examined. The problem is this: we have an administration that looked at data from my team's studies of this problem and at Judy Scott Clayton's studies of these problems at CCRC, the Community College Research Center, looked at us talking about the problem and decided, oh, that means we should cut the program. So the Trump budget proposal included slashing the federal work-study program by 75% and cited our work. That is heartbreaking. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's just important for people to know that when they think your solution is work-study, they need to know that in many, many cases, especially for Pell recipients, there isn't money available. So I report in the book on the percentage of Pell recipients at public institutions in this country who receive work-study support, and the percent is around 10. So if you think the Pell recipients get the most resources, not when it comes to the work-study program.
You also wrote about the National School Lunch Program that was introduced in 1946 for K through 12. And it was introduced primarily because policymakers were concerned that students were hungry and that they needed to not be hungry in order to be in a good place to learn. And then I actually saw one of your presentations here at Rutgers, and you reported an estimated 50% of students endure some kind of food insecurity, which blew me away. Can you share what else you've learned about that issue and offer some potential solutions?
Sure. So to be honest, I tell people a lot, like I had no idea I'd be studying food insecurity in higher education. This was a total accident, and it came from the students. When we were studying that aid program and we were asking students how things were going in college, people started to report that the trouble they had was that they couldn't eat. They didn't have enough money. They ran out. There was a lot of month left at the end of the money, they would say. And at first, we treated this with a fair dose of healthy skepticism because there's a lot of stereotypes that even infected my team. Stereotypes about ramen. You know, we think, what does that mean? You don't know that there are cheap meals? Do you not know about the dollar meal, right? Over time, we have come to understand what the rest of the world understands, which is that food insecurity is very real. It takes multiple forms. It can mean that you never get any nutritional, food. Nutritious food or balanced food. It can mean that you regularly miss meals. It can mean that, yeah, the dollar meal is fine on the days when you get paid and you have nothing on those other days. So this problem is definitely on campuses, and I can say that we moved from studying this in Wisconsin to studying this at community colleges around the country. And on Tuesday, we're releasing our brand new study. And this is this first time that universities have allowed us in to look at this problem. And we're going to report on 35 universities. 30 of them are public, 5 are private. And we're going to report for the first time our estimates for the 4-year institutions. And I can tell you that the 50% estimate that we have, which is across higher education, certainly would appear supported by the work that we're going to be putting out. It is higher at community colleges and lower at 4-year institutions. We are also finding widespread housing insecurity and homelessness. And it is not the case that this is only at places where there's lots of Pell recipients or places where the cost of living is really high. It is everywhere. I can pull up estimates from across the 3 studies that we have done in the last several years. So now I have more than, I have data from more than 150 institutions. And I can pull file after file and just look at their statistics on those issues. And they look remarkably similar. No matter where we go, no matter who asks us to do the survey, and no matter the fact that whether the response rate is relatively high or relatively low, we find these problems. And I think it's not a surprise because, as you noted, we have a national school lunch program that expires when a student graduates from high school. And we have a food stamp program that becomes much harder for people to get support from when they become adults. And we have subsidized housing programs that will literally toss out students who become full-time students. And the list goes on and on. Living expenses become infinitely more difficult to cover when people get to college. And it's simpler for them to cover them if they just don't go. And therein lies the rub, because they need to go if they want to be able to support themselves later in life.
Have you seen an emergence or a trend toward food banks at universities? Like
Yeah.
what are you wrote about someone's idea about 1 peanut butter sandwich a day, and by no means am I suggesting that that's
Yeah.
a good nutritional solution, but it's something, right?
It is. So Claire Cady and her fabulous team at the College and University Food Bank Alliance began an umbrella organization for college food pantries back in 2012. At the time, there were about a dozen pantries on campuses around the country. It is with a weird sense of pride that I say that today there are more than 565.
Wow.
And that she and her team are now part of my team at Temple University because we're trying to leverage that interest at those 565 institutions to get them to go beyond pantries. Food pantries are a nice start. They provide an educational mission of helping campuses recognize the problem and take a first baby step at an action. But food pantries have never solved food insecurity in any sense in any part of the world. And so the trick here is to go beyond them towards systemic and preventative solutions. And that's where our work is headed.
You wrote about the annual borrowing for student loans growing from 25 billion in the mid 90s to 70 billion in 2013-14. Now you've talked over and over again about the costs outside of tuition contributing to issues. What are some of the other factors contributing to the increases in loans? And what are some of the impacts on students' financial and emotional health?
Yeah. Okay, well, the first thing you got to know is that looking at total borrowing is not a great way to size up a problem, because we could have total borrowing increase dramatically if we just had more people go to college who thought loans were fine and they were able to repay them when they got out. It would be not a big deal, except that we have to lend that money, right? And from the government's perspective, we have the money. As long as we're repaid, we're fine. So one reason that the total amount went up is just more people went to college, and more people went to college who needed to borrow to go to college. Another reason is that more people are going to graduate school. And as they go to graduate school, they take out loans. But the part that I'm concerned about is the number of people borrowing for college who have very little chance of repaying. And the number one reason they have little chance of repaying is that their odds of graduating are not very high. Sometimes that's because they went to a not very good institution, like a for-profit. Sometimes it's because even with those loans, they are still so short of covering their college costs that they're likely to experience something like homelessness during college, and it's going to derail them. Another really big issue, though, is that even when low-income people graduate from college, they're going to struggle to repay the debt. And it's not from lack of trying. It is because of things like their family's need for their income in whole. Despite them wanting to repay the loan, they need to still continue to help feed their siblings, their parents, their cousins, their neighbors. It is because of things like continued discrimination in the labor market. The latest data show that the biggest overrepresentation of people who can't repay their student debt, even when they graduated from college, are African Americans. And this is not surprising, because this is a labor market that continues to discriminate against people of color. And so it is one reason why the loans and the requirement that they take loans in order to make ends meet is such a huge burden for that community. And the consequences are going to be devastating. It's not going to just be about the ability to purchase consumer things, consumer goods, houses, and cars. Frankly, that's going to be trivial compared to the impacts. The stress and strain that it's creating for them, their difficulty in establishing a life that's marked by any form of financial security, just stability, just a decent life, and their willingness to look at their child and say, yeah, we can do this. We can send you to college. All of that's going to shift. When the parent themselves still has debt or has had debt that has ruined their credit or pushed them towards bankruptcy, they're not going to make that bet on their kid. And that's going to be the story. I am absolutely sure that's going to be the story of the long-term effects of our concerted policy decision to ensure that even the poorest among us have no choice but to take loans.
So you brought up a student's contribution often back to the family. Can you talk about the concept of kinscripts and how that relates to issues?
Yeah, so I'm a sociologist, and sociologists have talked about this idea of kinscripts for a very long time. And one way to think of it is sort of what goes around comes around, or family takes care of each other, or going for kin is a way of so one of the ways that this works is in communities that are very impoverished. People work together in very close ways to try to share resources. So your auntie may help your mom with her car payment, even though your auntie is not actually related to your mom. She's like a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Because we treat her like an aunt, both because we love her, but because she provides this form of support, including financial support. And we find, and this has always been the case in communities all over the world where money is tight, that people do this together to survive. Now, fast forward to American higher education, and we have a system that likes to pretend that stuff doesn't happen. We have a system that pretends that when a low-income student goes to college, their family just cuts them loose and says, go for it. You're on your own. And by the way, here's a check every month to help you. That's not what happens. Instead, the family, with a great deal of trepidation, tries to release the student from the familial obligations during college, only to find out they can't make it without them. And as a result, the student continues to contribute to their family. So I have aid officers who have said to me, kind of like it's confidential, they've leaned over and said, you know what he's doing? He's sending that check to his mom. And some of them say it with disdain because you're not supposed to do that. And they say, doesn't he know he's not supposed to do that? And I think, we don't get to decide that. You don't get to decide if a young man helps feed his younger brother and sister. The only thing we get to decide is whether we're going to give that young man the money. You cannot police families. And it's what our aid system tries to do. The interesting thing is that programs all over the world have learned the hard way that policing people's money like that is a bad idea. It costs money to do that policing. And it actually lowers the effectiveness of what people do with the money. It is better to give people the autonomy and authority to make their own decisions about their scarce resources and respect familial units than to try to do this kind of paternalism. But the financial aid system in this country is deeply paternalistic. And so we see these enormous tensions created when the student can't get the expected family contribution and in fact is making a family contribution. This is part of the story of the student loans in this country. People are borrowing money for their families. And I think instead of being ashamed of that, we should be proud of them because they're doing the right and ethical and family smart thing to do.
Wow, there's so many layers of complexity to all this. It makes me wonder how do you get a legislator to sit and listen and understand all this complexity?
I don't explain all the complexity to the legislator. I pick a piece. I think that's an important thing, for those of us who want to do this kind of work. You have to understand that you vary your storytelling and your message and your explanation by your audience. You have a very well-educated audience. They need to hear the complexity because they're actually being pushed by other reforms, techno reforms, to think about things too simplistically. They need to know that predictive analytics alone, data alone, cannot explain the story that I just told. The legislator does not need me to explain everything that's wrong in these people's lives and all the layers that are broken. He needs me to explain why the thing that I am advancing as a solution fixes a piece of the puzzle. And only the most astute and seasoned legislators can hear a somewhat more advanced narrative that might say, look, couple supports for work, right? Work supports, like a basic income for families and a right to a job with a lower college price and high quality childcare. And we will have a very different society, right? The most seasoned legislators can handle that combination.
Yeah. All right. Those are good talking points. Oh, hope everyone's writing them down. So you bring up this chapter where you talk about truth in advertising as an issue. Can you elaborate on that thought and offer some recommendations? Like, what information can and should colleges be sharing that they're not?
Yeah. All right. So let's just take a relatively simple topic like the living expenses and think about what we advertise and what we could advertise. So the first thing is that by federal law, we disclose at each institution, we disclose an estimated cost of living off campus. We also disclose on campus, and to some extent, it's truthful because we control it at an institution. So, Rutgers has prices for its residence halls, and it usually is listing the average price. It is in some ways not truthful because a student on financial aid might not be able to afford to live in the nicest, newest dormitory. And that creates some income segregation on our campuses and, frankly, racial segregation. But a much larger issue comes when you write down what does it cost to live off campus. Because the truth is that the people setting those numbers really don't know. They are doing the best they can with surveys or reading the newspaper to look at ads for, rentals to try to decide what the cost is for people. And studies have now shown, studies led by Robert Kelchin and Braden Hosh and myself, have shown there's a lot of error and a lot of variation in those living cost estimates. And it wreaks havoc for students. So let's even take a student who's not on financial aid, a student whose family is just saving for college. If they look and they say, well, this is what it's going to cost you to live off campus, and they're wrong, and it's too little, right? The real costs are higher, then they're not going to have enough money in hand. A student on financial aid, well, their financial aid is capped by your estimate. So when they come to their aid officer and they say, man, I don't know what you're talking about, but I can't get a roommate in a one-bedroom apartment for what you say on there I can get. The aid officer goes, well, you need to learn to live within your means. Instead of considering the possibility that they have the wrong number. Right. And sometimes I can tell you, because of the most honest and transparent financial aid officers out there, they've told me they've tried to raise those numbers. They've gone to the provost or the president and said, look, that off-campus living estimate, that's like 5 years old. It's not true now. The problem is the institution, the leaders don't want to raise the price because it will raise the overall cost of attendance for the institution, and nobody right now wants to look more expensive. That's not wrong to not want to look more expensive, but it's wrong to offer bad information to students and constrain their eligibility for financial aid. And by the way, this is a game that institutions that make no loans promises also play. They'll tell you, well, we got you. You're fully covered. We meet all need. Yeah, but the need is defined by a bunch of fake numbers. And this is how students fall short.
Wow. And of course, everyone has to be truthful in order for that to work, right? All institutions have to be transparent.
Well, we don't need them to make the decision. That's the thing. Our recommendation is that this job should not rest with institutions. Oh. There is county-level cost of living information readily available. Why don't we just list that? Learn what the off-campus is from those estimates, rather than estimates created by each institution that's held accountable for it. Just relieve the aid officers of this incredible burden of producing these estimates.
And that cost of living doesn't factor into federal formulas, as I understand it, right?
Oh no, it's in the cost of attendance. I mean, so the federal formula, when they say how much money do you need to go to college, that's in there. The thing is, we're putting bad data into that formula, right? I mean, if take books. There are schools that are still estimating that semester book expenses are $500, when $500 could sometimes barely cover the books for a class.
Yeah.
So I think everybody can understand, well, that's not the right number. And maybe we shouldn't be telling students that all you need is $500 for a semester when the real number is $1,000. I think we can all understand that's just not a good idea. And yet schools are asked every single time to estimate those book expenses.
So as you were talking, I was one of those students who was living off of $6 for $1. It was $6 for $1
Yeah.
Back in the day, ramen noodles. And when I had a good day, I had some minute rice I could add to that mix. And I also wound up working 50, sometimes 60 hours a week to pay my way through school. And there's no doubt it had an impact on my studies. Can you share some of the research that you've uncovered about number of hours worked as it relates to GPA? Because the solution is always, oh,
Yeah.
back in the day, I just worked a job to help pay my way through school. But
Yeah. Hey, look, I did too. I get it. I mean, what I always say is I wish we could work our way through college again. I wish college prices were at a modest enough level that working 20 hours a week or less could cover it. I also wish students could easily get 20 hours a week of employment, because the news story has to do with the changed economy. So when you go looking for a job right now and you need a part-time job, you're competing with a whole bunch of people who are not in college and who are also looking for part-time jobs. And they're looking for part-time jobs because they can't find full-time jobs. So they actually want two. So you got all these people out there who are applying for jobs, and you're in college and you've got class on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sometimes on Fridays. And that's going to change next semester. You're at an incredible disadvantage with regard to talking to those employers. They're really not looking at you favorably. So we've got students who can't even get 20 hours a week of employment. We also have students who are told, oh, yeah, you're getting 20 hours a week, except that 2 weeks later, well, business isn't so good, so you're getting 6. And 3 weeks later, well, it's 13. And next week, oh, it's 32. Well, students don't live by those averages, right? Their bills are due whether or not they got the numbers of hours that they needed. And so the idea that we've missed that, and the idea that we've failed to understand that the declining value of the minimum wage is also affecting our students, right? This fight for 15 is viewed as some sort of fight that's only about people who only go to high school, don't go to college. It's a college graduation issue, because if they made more money per hour, they could work fewer hours. Like, it's all of this is related. And, if we could get back to a time where you could get the hours you needed and you could get a wage that you needed and you could work on campus, boy, is that looking good right now. It's a far cry from where we're at. We're counting the number of students who are not working, but not because they don't want to, because they're literally unemployed. They're searching for work and they can't find work. And when we release the new report next week, you will see the relationship between the number of hours worked and unemployment and food and housing insecurity. And you will see that those students who are food and housing insecure are working the longest hours or are the most likely to be unemployed. Not voluntarily unemployed, like they're staying at home, just chilling, okay? These people are food and housing insecure because they can't get enough work.
So you brought up the research that's coming out this week. Can you talk about some other research that you'd like to see in the future in terms of affordability?
Yeah, I think the most exciting work that we're doing, frankly, is not the survey report that's coming out is great because we counted people. And the more counting that we do, the more descriptive evidence that institutions have to take actions. But what institutions really need is evidence on what works to fix these problems. And so the most exciting work that's going on around the country is efforts to study the programs that people are putting in place and trying to figure out if they'll actually do the job. And so we've got some studies. One of them's in Boston. We're studying the effects of a meal voucher program. Give students vouchers and let them go to the cafeteria and eat. We're studying a program in Houston where a community college is giving students food scholarships using food from a local food bank. They get up to 60 pounds of groceries every 2 weeks. And it's like going to a farmer's market and getting everything that you need. And we're studying a housing voucher program in Tacoma, Washington, where students are getting Section 8 vouchers, subsidized housing, while they're in school. Other people are looking, for example, at the effects of giving students more access to public benefits, right? What happens when we provide more information on campuses about how you can get on food stamps, right? What happens when we text message people and nudge them to, for example, file their taxes and get the earned income tax credit, right? There's a whole variety of interventions that we could be doing. Another one that's super interesting is a place in Los Angeles where they're doing rapid rehousing for students. There's a whole world out there that higher ed doesn't know about, using a model called Housing First that says the first thing you do to help somebody who's having trouble with housing is get them housed. The next thing you do is support them with psychosocial supports and advising and education and all that stuff. But the first thing you do is house them. And that has been proven through a large series of randomized controlled trials over time. So we need to implement in higher ed partnerships that bring housing first plus education models together, ideally with case management, to help students get back on track and finish their degrees.
This really comes back to a lot of Maslow's hierarchy, right?
Oh God, it's all about Maslow. Maslow is my everyday right now.
So you alluded to some talking points for legislators and really keeping it simple and focused and pointed. Can you share some other actions or strategies we can employ to advocate for affordability?
Yes, I can give you very simple things you can do on your campuses. So campuses don't know what's happening if they don't count. If you don't ask students on surveys if they're okay with their food and housing, then you don't know. So we've published a guide. The Wisconsin Hope Lab has a guide to assessing food insecurity and housing insecurity on your campus. Gives you the basic questions, tells you how to do it. We are also offering any college or university the opportunity to do our survey this fall. And we'll do it for you, and we'll give you a report, okay? Very simple. Another thing you can do, you need to help people on campus know these are actual problems and take them seriously. And one way that you can do that is you can introduce the idea that the faculty would put on their syllabus a statement that says, if you're having trouble with food or housing, here's who you go to. This is your chance to put your best student affairs professional, their email address and their name front and center on the syllabus received by every student, the same way you do for disability accommodations. And the beautiful part of doing that on the syllabus, and again, we have put the syllabus statement up. If you Google my name and syllabus statement, it'll come right up. You can make it your own. But the best part is, number one, you're telling students that there are supports available on your campus. Even if they're minimal, there's still something. Number two, you're educating your faculty that this is a thing and they need to take it seriously. And number three, you're letting the students educate the faculty, because what's going to happen is the students are going to go tell the professors about their lives. And I think that's one of the best things that could happen in higher education, is that the faculty could get caught up on what it means to really be in college now. Beyond that, we need people to bring their best partnership skills to the table. So if you know the guy who works at the food bank in your town, you need to help connect your college to the food bank. If you know people who have large empty houses because their kids have gone to college, you can create a host home program where you take in students and provide them with rent-free housing. You can support your emergency aid program on your campus, maybe doing employee donations. $5 a month can create a fund that is flexible and should be delivered quickly to students in need. You can support programs at the state level. There are a lot of promise programs out there right now. These are a good step in the direction of establishing college as a right. They're not all going to cover living expenses, and that's actually okay, because what happened when we established K-12 education as a right is that we then put living expense programs around them. We got the National School Lunch Program after we said public higher education is a right. Sorry, not public higher education, public K-12 education. Do this first. Make public higher education a right and establish tuition-free public education at colleges and universities. And then we will get the National School Lunch Program. And then we will get the housing program and the things that follow. So, being aware that there is an incrementalism to this, working towards a much broader goal, is incredibly important. It's so important that nobody takes this data on food and housing insecurity and says, I don't like your free tuition program. The students don't appreciate it when you do that, because the students know all money is green. And if they don't have to spend money on tuition, then they can spend money on food. So these things all work together.
I love it. I love that we can talk about policy, but these are some great concrete strategies that everyone can go back and advocate for at their institution. So last 2 minutes, are there some resources, websites, books, conferences, newsletters that you can share that can help people continue to learn? Sure.
That's a great opening. All right. So I think some of your audience knows Claire Cady. Claire is now with my team at Temple University. She's our Director of Research Application and Dissemination. She's the Director of RAD. And
awesome.
Claire is leading the effort to host our third annual Real College Conference. #Real College is what is our signal for what college is really like now. And college does include these challenges. So this is the only national conference to focus exclusively on how to address food and housing insecurity. People come together to do work. This is not a conference full of fringe and fanciness. This is a no-frills conference where you spend 2 days in Philadelphia learning about how to do this work and getting with the people who can help you do it. And it's going to be September 29th and 30th in Philadelphia. It's a weekend, which we're actually hoping makes it easier. We keep the cost extremely low, and I can tell you that our reviews are great because people say this is not a waste of my time. This is very concrete. We are just about to launch the Real College website, which is going to include all sorts of resources related to everything that I said. It should be going up in the next month. And we're also giving you all an opportunity to help elevate your students' voices. So one of the ways that policy change and systems change happens is that people have to listen firsthand to the people who are experiencing these problems. But students are very vulnerable when they tell these stories, many of them very embarrassed. So we are giving them an opportunity to put their stories out there with audio, not video, not asking them to put their faces on camera. We're asking them to record their stories and submit them to what we're calling Voices for Change. It'll be a national campaign. It's going to launch April 18th. And we're going to let people all over the country get with their students, get these stories recorded, submit them to this larger website. We're going to license them. And you're going to be able to go on and say, I want to talk about college students in New Jersey and their issues. And you're going to be able to download those stories and share them as you like. They're not just for my team's use, they're for all of our collective use, so that we can advance this agenda using the voices and stories of the real people who are really affected. These are the witnesses to this challenge. And so that's another resource for you. The last thing I'll mention is the Wisconsin Hope Lab has a website, has a lot of resources on it and a lot of data. This summer, the Wisconsin Hope Lab will close, and we will reopen as an evolved version of the Hope Lab and Temple University this fall as the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. Rest assured, the old website will point you to the new website. Everything will be very fluid. And so if you go now and get signed up to get the Wisconsin Hope Lab newsletter, you'll get the information about the new Hope Center in the fall. And there are a lot of great folks doing work all over the country, and our website will be pointing you, for example, to the wonderful work in California, led by the CSUs and the UCs, to the wonderful efforts of Swipe Out Hunger and Holla for Hunger and Mazone and a million other organizations, all of which are small and underfunded, frankly, but all of whom are really fighting this fight to make this Real College movement an effort to end food and housing insecurity around the country.
Fantastic. I'm so excited. I'm gonna have to put the conference on my calendar. You're certainly not far away.
And interview people at the conference. That would be great.
That's a great idea. But Sara, thank you. You obviously have so much passion for this topic and have done so much good work. Thank you so much for sharing your
got
time
a great team
and wisdom.
Village, man. They say it and it's so true.
No doubt. Yeah. And thanks as always to our program sponsors. Heather Shea, a student affairs colleague, will be back next week with the authors of How College Affects Students. I'll be back later in the month. You can receive reminders about this and other great shows by subscribing to the HigherEdLive newsletter. You can also browse the archives at HigherEdLive.com or subscribe to our iTunes podcast. I'm Tony Duty. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you make it a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.